The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right. Hey, everybody. This is Karen. I am going to give folks another couple minutes to sign on, but I wanted you to know that we are here. And Taylor, if you could start the recording too, just to make sure we have that, if you haven't already, that would be great.
You got it.
All right. Well, it is 1 o'clock, and so I'm going to go ahead and get started. It looks like we might have a small crew today. We have a few more people signed up than we have on the line, so hopefully other people will join in. But we are recording this, and so if you have colleagues who are not on the line who you expected to see today, know that they can watch this online later if you think it might be useful. So we're going to focus today on attendee interviews and qualitative coding. We're going to start off with having me talk a little bit about a specific example and provide some general updates about the EvalFest project overall. And then I'm going to hand things over to Jen, and she is going to give us all a tour of InVito. So, oops, hang on. So these are the two goals for today. The first is to share methods that have been used to collect both day of and short-term follow-up interviews within a festival context. And we're going to use the National Math Festival evaluation from 2017 as our example. And then we're going to talk about coding strategies. I'm going to talk very quickly about how you might manually code the kinds of data that you'll see in the example today. And then Jen is going to use the databases from the National Math Festival to give all of us a tour of what the coding looked like in the InVito software program. Before I get into any more details, I wanted to give a couple of shout outs. I don't know, let me see if anybody is on the line, if any of our advisors are on the line today. I don't think so, which is too bad because they are our shout out for the day. So you guys may remember, if you were able to tune in for the September webinar, that we were expecting the advisors to descend on Chapel Hill a week or two after our last webinar meeting. And we had 6 advisors join us for a 2-day meeting that was fantastic and a little bit mind-boggling because their ideas were so good. And then Amy Grack Nelson and Pat Jessup also joined us for that. And so I'm going to show a couple things related to that in a few minutes, but you will also start to see probably changes in plans or new or more refined plans coming out in the next few months as we have the chance to debrief and start to process some of the advice that they gave us in that meeting. All right. I wanted to show this again really quickly. This is from last month's webinar. You got a copy of this in the newsletter from this month when Taylor sent that out last week as well. We did show this to the advisors, and I just wanted you to remind you that it exists. It will be relevant in a couple of minutes again because we have a new study that came out in the last week or two to add to some of the literature that goes around the top there. It's not there yet, but I'll add it in and send an updated slide. We also wanted to show this. So this was something that we created for the advisors. It is sort of the vision of EvalFest, or the journey toward our vision. And we gave this to them as a way to provide just a quick 1 page of context for what this project is all about. So we had them look at this before they came to the meeting, and I wanted to make sure that all of you had access to this as well in case it's helpful for anything that you are up to. This one is a little bit of a teaser. So this is what the templates look like. And I think I mentioned that we were considering using this one with our advisors. We did end up doing that. And so we have somebody this week who's working on taking all of the different trends that they identified for us and putting them into one of two maps. So we asked them to come up with all kinds of trends for public engagement with science, and that was a very large set. And then we asked them to narrow down those that they thought were the most relevant for us as the EvalFest project. And so we're pulling those together into two graphics that take all of the general labels that you see here and replace them with their advice and feedback. And so we'll be presenting those to you sometime in the near future as well, so that you can see how they think about positioning festivals and positioning EvalFest in the larger context of public engagement with science. So stay tuned for that. This is the new study that I mentioned. So this came out, as I said, a couple of weeks ago. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, it is an interesting read. Although now that I've said that, I have to also admit that I haven't read the whole thing myself. Part of what's interesting about it, we think, is that you can see the title, Preaching to the Scientifically Converted. And then they talk specifically about inclusivity in science festival audiences. Their findings indicate that science festivals abroad are not nearly as inclusive as we would want them to be. And so this is going to be an interesting conversation point for us as a community and for thinking about the EvalFest data in the next couple of months. Catherine and Todd are going to be pulling together one of the first publications that we tried to submit with the community level data. And so in some ways, it's nice that this just came out, and we think the EvalFest data will have a different perspective to offer. And so there may be an interesting counterpoint to think through in relation to this article. For now, we just wanted you to know that it's out there in case you want to look it up and get an idea of what festival attendees look like across the pond. All right. So the topic we really want to focus on today relates to qualitative data collection, as I said earlier, and specifically the evaluation of the National Math Festival. Before I get too much further into the content today, I wanted to give a shout out to David Eisenbud and Kirsten Bohl for allowing us to share this today. They were very gracious in allowing us to share the instruments that we used for this evaluation and to let you take a look under the hood in InVito. So thank you to both of them for that. Now, some of you may be sitting out there wondering why we're doing this and what the relevance is. And so I wanted to start with that up front to frame where I'm hoping Jen and I are going to take you over the next few minutes. So there are a few reasons that we wanted to share this example. The first is that the EvalFest community has been interested in using more qualitative methods for a while. But as you guys all know, as a project, we haven't really focused on that yet. We don't have a lot of qualitative methods that most festivals are using, and we don't have any common measures other than those that we just started to initiate for the outgroup survey and for some of the motivation work. People in the community, as we also all know, are particularly interested in longer term data collection, and this evaluation included both of those components. So it's another example and one that we haven't focused on as a group yet, and so we're hoping that it's going to be of interest to people for that reason. As an extension of that idea, if you were on the line in September, you'll remember that we talked about the possibility of allowing people to walk away from the attendee survey for year 4 and year 5. So if you are a festival who thinks you've learned everything you can from that, our hope is that we will come up with a system that we can use to still have common measures, and something like what happened for the National Math Festival might fall into that category. And so we're hoping that this will be a good way to get your brain buzzing about whether EvalFest as a community should be taking a more qualitative focus. The final reason is sort of an extension of what I just mentioned, but also an extension of what happened at IPSEC this year. So for me, one of the big take-home messages from the IPSEC conference was the need for more and better qualitative data so that we could really start to tell the story of festival goers and to use data to do that. And collecting stories was a primary focus of this particular evaluation, and so hopefully it will feel like a logical extension of some of those IPSEC and annual meeting conversations as well. So here's what we did. We used two primary methods to collect data across two different time points. So one of the big questions for the National Math Festival team related to who attended and why, and those questions are near and dear to most of us as well. So we used a demographic survey that was modeled heavily on the EvalFest items that you all know and love. And the big difference for me in what I do for the North Carolina Science Festival and what we did for the National Math Festival is the fact that we asked for contact information at the end of the survey. So we asked people if they would be willing to let us call them back or get back in touch with them in a few weeks. And if they said yes, then we asked them to give their name, their phone number, and their email address. We also had a team of people out on the floor during the festival itself collecting qualitative interviews. We had a child and an adult protocol, and you'll see those in a minute. And both of those were really designed to try to get people talking about their time at the event so that we did have stories instead of just really quick answers to interview questions. Then, as I mentioned a second ago, we had this follow-up plan as well. So 2 months after the festival event itself, we used that contact information to get back in touch with people to try to gather some longer-term impressions and some longer-term stories about the event. So what happened? I'm not going to talk a lot about the demographic survey data today, but because the process was similar, I thought it might be helpful for you guys to know sort of how it went. So we ended up with 765 demographic surveys in total. These surveys were pretty much the same length that all of us use for EvalFest. What was different is we had 10 people out on the floor who collected data for about 7 hours each. So this was a really long event if you're thinking about how to gauge sort of your own progress and work in relation to this particular number. In case some of you have calculated your refusal rates for your EvalFest data this year and you're trying to think about, whether that number makes sense or not, I thought I would share this. We had an 18% refusal rate at the National Math Festival. And so that means in addition to the 765 people who completed a survey, we had 169 people who turned us down. More importantly for today's discussion, approximately 1/3 of the people who demographic survey and hear about the most of today. These are the data that Jen is going to use when she does the InVito demo. So we had 194 interviews. We collected those, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, we had 6 people out on the floor collecting interviews for about 6 hours on the day of the festival. They alternated back and forth between the adult protocol and the child protocol. And of that 194 interviews, we had 87 that were with kids and then 107 that were with adults. All right, and here's what we did. So these are the kinds of data that we collected. Because we wanted stories, we only asked a few questions and they were targeted toward very particular ideas. And then we followed up with lots of probes. So if you guys have tried this kind of work in your festival before, you may know that if you're out and you ask a question, unless you have a very skilled interviewer, it's actually pretty tricky to get people to give you a full story instead of just one quick answer. And so the hope with this protocol and the way that it was set up is that we would target these big ideas and then we would poke at it from lots of different directions with the hope that by the time we moved on to the next big idea, we had a story that we could think about. And so for the kids, we were really focused on 3 different things. The first bucket of questions or cluster of questions you see on the slide is really, a favorite thing kind of a conversation. But we really wanted them to talk about what the experience was like, to find out why they picked it, and then to find out where they thought the math was. Now, where the math was actually ended up being not a useful question. And that had happened in a prior evaluation that the Math Festival team had done. We wanted to try it one more time and see if we got better data, but we didn't. And so if you're reading that question and thinking that it looks good, I would recommend shying away from that. But we did have this question about, what would you totally definitely keep, and the kids' stories that came out as a result of that. Then we moved on to the hardest thing that they did at the festival. because the math festival, like many of our festivals, was designed sort of, you know, for people across the lifespan. And some of the activities are quite challenging. And so we wanted to know for the kids how they responded to that. And then the last question had to do with places that they go to do other kinds of math activities, and what was the same and what was different about the context of the festival itself. For the adult questions, we started with a couple questions really just to get people talking. The graphic or the list that you see under the National Math Festival logo was a card that we handed everybody to go along with that first question that you see bolded on the screen. So that was really the motivation question. And these motivation categories are an extension of the work that Richard and Jeremy have been doing in Arizona. So this list of topics resonated more directly with the National Math Festival than the ones that many of us use on our quick tap surveys already. And so we handed people the card and used this as a way to get them talking about why they were at the festival that day, and then what they had done since they got there, to sort of walk us through their progress at the event. The things that we really cared about were these. And so you can see there are some parallels between what we asked adults and what we asked kids. The first and the last question on this slide are pretty much the same. The wording is a little bit different for the first question, but we wanted to know what was the most memorable experience and to have them tell stories about what made it memorable. Then we have the other places that they go to do math. And then we have a question about the biggest surprise of the festival that day. And so that was pretty much it. We got all of this data, and we used a company called VerbaLink to do the transcripts. And if you ever need transcription services, I highly recommend this group. You submit everything online. It's super easy. More importantly, for what we were trying to accomplish with this evaluation, they turned our data around to us in a week, and they did it in a format that could plug directly into InVito. And so they made our job really, really easy. And that was particularly important because the National Math Festival team actually wanted all of the transcripts. And so by setting it up to go straight into InVito using headings and normal text, we were able to upload it to InVito, and then in a couple of clicks, reorganize all of the data so that everybody's responses for each individual question were lined up and could be downloaded straight out of the system and sent to the client, which was a huge time saver for us. Then it came time to do the coding. And as many of you probably know, there are two ways to approach coding qualitative data, and we did a little bit of each. So there is this sort of know before you go approach, which you may have heard referred to as either deductive coding or a priori coding. And this is what we did with the motivation items. So the motivation items that Richard and Jeremy have developed, as you know, line directly up to Falk's categories. And so we already knew how to code those. We knew what we were going to do with those data before we hit the festival floor and even started trying to collect them. For everything else, we needed to use an inductive approach, which is sort of the figure it out when you get there approach. And so with this system, we sort of relied on the data and the themes that we saw coming through the data once we had those transcripts back from VerbaLink to decide what the codes were, what the themes were that seemed to be coming through. And we designed our coding scheme based on those. So here's one of the things that stuck out when we read through the data. There were some people who identified themselves or their kids as math people as part of their responses to the interview questions. And so they would say, well, you know, I'm here because I'm a math person, and anytime there's a math activity in town, I try to go. There were lots of different ways that people identified themselves, but that stuck out as a potential key difference. The National Math Festival was really interested in learning more about their audience, and so this seemed like it had the potential to be a key grouping variable for us. People who self-identified as math people and other people who still came to the festival but didn't go out of their way in the comments that they made to us to describe themselves as math people explicitly. So we went through and coded every transcript as either a math person or a not math person so that we could use those grouping variables to look at all of the other coding that we did to see if there were in fact differences based on how people identified. We also had some pretty cool responses from kids in response to that question about like, what was the hardest activity you did today? And it became clear when we were reading through the transcripts that some of the kids really liked that experience and some of them were not so keen on it. So we had people talking about how fun the challenge was, or kids talking about how fun the challenge was, and then others talking about getting really frustrated and that not feeling so great. And so we decided to go back through all of the transcripts for both adults and kids and add this affective coding anytime somebody was talking about something that was particularly challenging for them. And then, as you can imagine, given that we also had the math and the not math people codes, we were really interested to see if math people had different affect when they talked about things that were difficult compared to people who did not identify as math people. And what's cool about InVivo that you'll see in a few minutes is that with a couple of clicks, you can answer this question. We also used the demographic data to try to target who we followed up with after the festival. So some of you on the line today have really expressed an interest in the past in learning more about the adult learners who come to our events. And that was of interest to the National Math Festival team also. They really wanted to target people who came to the event without kids to learn more about that particular audience. And so when it came time to follow up with those 237 people, we targeted these folks first. So we used their demographic survey data to identify people who came but who reported they were not there with children. And those are the people we recruited first to try to make sure that we had about half of our sample that were adult learners. And then we filled the rest of the sample with family learners. We ended up doing 50 follow-up interviews and we ended up with about half and half in each category. And that ended up becoming a key grouping variable in the follow-up analysis that we did. These are the follow-up interview questions in case you guys are interested in those. So the first question was really just to get them talking. We didn't do a lot with how did they hear about the festival. But what we really wanted to do was get into some of these later questions. And so if you look at number 2, number 1 and number 2 are new compared to the questions that you've already seen from the day of interview, but 3 and 4 are pretty much the same. And we did that on purpose because we wanted to have some questions that were unique to the follow-up interviews, but we also wanted the potential to use some of the exact same questions to see if people were talking about the same kinds of memorable activities and experiences on the day of the festival as they were 2 months after attending the event. Number 5 and number 6 on this slide were really there to try to understand how to reach the kinds of audiences we were talking to more, particularly the adult audiences. And then number 7 was our attempt to document some of the longer term impact of the festival. So what really stuck with people? What were they still thinking about? What kinds of activities did they continue to do after their experience at the event? All right. And so those are the kinds of data that we have to work with and the kinds of data that you're going to see Jen talk about in a couple of minutes. I am about to turn things over, but before I do that, I wanted to mention that you can do almost all of the, well, you can do all of the kinds of coding actually that you're going to see Jen talk about and show in InVivo on your own and manually. And so if you are not in a position to buy an expensive software package like InVivo or Atlas TI or any of the others that are out there on the market, I wanted to say very loudly and clearly that that does not mean that you cannot collect these kinds of data. So if I look back across sort of the history of my company, I actually only bought InVivo myself a couple of years ago because I didn't feel like I needed it up until then. I didn't have enough qualitative data, and the data that I did have were not sophisticated enough to make this investment feel worth it to me. That flipped a couple of years ago because I started doing a lot more qualitative work, and then it did feel like it made sense. But up until that point, I was coding on hard copies of transcripts in some cases, and then literally sorting them into stacks when I wanted to look at one group versus another, and using those stacks to sort of enter my data into SPSS and use other statistical packages or Excel to do more of the coding after. The other thing that we would sometimes do before we had InVivo, and that we still do today, if we have a smaller data set or a data set that we know we just need quick answers from, is to just code directly in Excel. So to load the responses into Excel and to code in Excel. I want to do a quick plug for Taylor's training videos here, because some of the videos that are already online will give you the filtering and sorting and scoring techniques that you need to have Excel make your life much easier when it comes to qualitative coding. And so there are lots of ways to do this. InVivo certainly allows you some potential that you wouldn't have otherwise, but you don't have to have it if you think that qualitative data might be a good fit for your festival in the future. All right, so I am about to hand things over to Jen, but before I do that, I wanted to see if anybody has any questions about sort of the procedures that we used for the data collection, or any of the methods before we turn things over and talk more about the coding directly. And so if you want to raise your hand, I'm happy to unmute your mic, or you can type into the questions tab and Taylor will read those out.
And I have one from Gina already.
Awesome.
She said, do you match follow-up surveys with the initial survey so you knew what the interviewer said initially?
We matched them, so yes, is the quick answer. But we didn't have stories from people on both the day of and stories from people 2 months later. We switched the two samples. So we did go back and match all of the demographics that we had from that initial demographic survey and their motivations for coming and things like that with the open-endeds that we had, so that we didn't have to ask those questions again when we followed up with them 2 months later. But we didn't collect data in a way that would allow us to compare stories from the same people on the day of and those same people's stories 2 months later. All right, let's see. Anybody else? I don't see hands or questions other than Gina's. All right. So this is the most precarious point in our conversation today, because I'm going to attempt to turn things over to Jen. So everybody sit tight and we'll see how this happens. Okay. Yay. So Jen, I'm seeing your screen, I think. If you want to go into full slideshow mode.
And you don't see the box, do you? No. Okay.
Zoom. You weren't kidding. In a flash. The whole first half of the webinar in a flash.
All right. Just getting a little situated here. All right. So thank you, Karen. I get the opportunity to demonstrate InVivo for everyone today, using the data from the National Math Festival. So just a brief agenda for us. We will talk about InVivo, what it is, what it can do, and this is really geared toward those folks on the line who really don't have a lot of familiarity with InVivo and what it can do. We'll talk just very briefly about some terms, and then we'll talk about the importance of being able to import and export into InVivo. As Karen mentioned earlier, there will be a live demonstration, and I don't know if folks can hear that or not, but there was supposed to be a karate chop, and we're going to get chopping. So if you are still wondering about why you would use InVivo, I created a list of statements that I hope you may be able to see yourself in. So first, I have a large amount of data, it's qualitative data, and I just can't wait to analyze it. So if you find yourself in this position, then InVivo is fantastic because it's going to allow you to work with a large set of qualitative data. Additionally, it's going to let you parse out your data and kind of chop it up and dice it in some really interesting ways that can be very useful for uncovering patterns that may exist in your data. I have multiple people on my team coding these data. If you see yourself in this statement, this can be a really great way for multiple people to work on the same project and to be able to do so with a common platform. I want a better way to manage my qualitative data and analyses. And this is also going to reduce your need for paper copies. So just in terms of storage and efficiency and organization, InVivo is fantastic as a way to store your data and analyze them. If you find yourself affiliated with an academic institution, then you may see yourself in this next statement. My institution has access, so why not? If you have access to the software, it can be immensely useful for working with your qualitative data again. So if you have that access, take advantage of it. And hopefully we can give you a little bit of the nuts and bolts today to get you started in the event that you have not done so yet. My favorite one is the last one, I just wanna. So perhaps you just want to stay abreast of the newest software and what folks in the industry are using to analyze qualitative data. If you find yourself in that statement, then InVivo is a fantastic platform to work from. Just a few considerations. You're going to see that there are different versions for Mac and Windows. What we have here is a screenshot of some of the different options that is offered for InVivo 11. And you'll see there's one version for Mac. There are 3 different versions for a Windows platform. And each one of these different options offers you a little bit different capability in terms of the type of data that are handled, your analysis capabilities, and then also data visualization capabilities. So just from the image that you see here, you'll notice that InVivo for Mac is able to handle a wide array of data. When you look over at InVivo Starter for Windows, you'll see that you're only going to be able to handle text documents with that particular version. You don't see a lot of difference between InVivo Pro and InVivo Plus here for this particular screenshot that you see, but I did want to just point out a couple of the differences that you'll see in other kinds of capabilities between Pro and Plus. With Pro, you're going to gain the opportunity to do some auto coding and merging your projects. It'll also allow you to do some more sophisticated kinds of queries. And nicely, you can also import directly from Qualtrics and SurveyMonkey. So if you are collecting some of your qualitative data using those survey platforms, then InVivo Pro for Windows likes that and will automatically import that for you without a whole lot of headache. When you are thinking about InVivo Plus, again, you're going to gain some additional capabilities. Here you can begin to do social network analysis, and you can begin to do things like pattern-based auto coding, which will cut down on some of the time it would take to analyze a very large set of data. Just a few terms in case you are completely unfamiliar with InVivo. Internals you can think about as being your data. These are the files where your data live. And you will import those files into a project in InVivo. And then from there you can access each individual file and code it. The nodes are going to correspond to your codes. So if you were doing this manually, you might think about color coding or developing some kind of system to very clearly code your data. With InVivo, you identify these as nodes, and there's a very nice drag and drop feature that allows you to very quickly go through your files and code data. The coding stripes I found to be particularly useful. This is a feature in InVivo that allows you to use color to provide a visual representation of your data that have already been coded. So if you need to stop midway through your coding and walk away from your project, you can come back, you can turn on your coding stripes, and you can see immediately what you've coded, where you left off. You're also able to kind of turn this on when you're working with multiple codes, and it can just be a very useful visual for helping me think about your data as they're being coded and all of their complexity. And then finally, the queries are very useful for looking at patterns and also investigating patterns within patterns. So you may be wondering how to kind of translate the value from using the software into reporting or something a bit more practical for your uses. Just like you import those data into InVito, you're able to very easily export data as well. So I'll walk you through a couple of different options that you have where you can export the nodes, which will allow you to pull out all the examples of the data that you've coded as a particular node. And you can do so in a variety of formats. You can quickly scan through them and you can do any counting, or you can pull out the best examples for your reports very quickly, very easily. So import to analyze, you'll export to report, and hopefully that's going to make you a happy person. So with that, we are going to switch screens, and we will take a look at InVito. So again, these are the National Math Festival data that Karen spent the first part of the webinar talking about. And I just want to point out a few things and a few features that I found to be especially useful. One is that over on the side, you have your internals. Again, these are the data that you import. Each one of these rows would represent a transcript. If you come down here, you can also see that we can quickly access our nodes. And there are a couple of other features like the collections and the queries that we're going to talk about as well, but I want to hang tight for just a second. I want to show you something called Detail View, because we will be waiting for that to open. So here we've opened a transcript. We want to start doing some coding. We can click on nodes, and you're going to see here that we have all of our nodes that correspond to the interview questions. Over here on the right side of the screen, we have the transcript. So if you go up to Detail View, there are a couple of different options where you can just kind of toggle back and forth depending on your personal preference. If you want to see your nodes at the top and your transcript at the bottom, or if you want to see instead your nodes here in the center and your transcripts over to the right. So if we were going to set up a node, for example, we would go up to our top menu, and let's see if I can. Probably should have practiced this one. Let's go back. So, my apologies. Here we go. So create, if we want to create a node, we would name our node. Here we can just say something like test 1. We can also add our description here. So if you are working either deductively or inductively, however you are thinking about your coding strategy and each particular code, you can go in and you can very clearly define that information here. And InVito will store it all for you, and it allows you to go back and look at it, or share files among people and have people be able to go in and see how other people have coded particular nodes. So if we were going to code, we might start here with our first example. And very easily we can highlight whatever chunk of our text that we want to code and drag it over and just put it in one of these buckets that it corresponds with, of course. So very easy just in terms of being able to go through your transcript, chunk it out, and put it in the appropriate bucket. So here we are looking at one of our transcripts, and I do want to point out something that ended up being important for this particular project. All of the transcripts were formatted using a consistent format, and because of that, when they were imported into an InVito, InVito was able to go ahead and automatically generate some of these headings. which are really useful when we start thinking about ways to parse out our data. So what we have here, we have our nodes in the center, we have one individual transcript, but let's say we are interested in looking at kids' responses to the question about their favorite activity. We're able to click on that node, and in just a second you're going to see that all of the responses from people who were asked that question are going to come up for you. So again, if you are kind of going through your data and you're using a more inductive approach, this can be super useful for seeing all of your responses to a particular question in one place, kind of going through and looking for those emergent themes. I do want to show you how to turn on the coding stripes. I think they're super useful. So here you'll notice that coding stripes is an option at the top. I'm going to select all nodes coding, and what we're going to see over here now on the far right are the coding stripes. I'm going to make this a little smaller so you can see. And this is going to include all of the codes, all of those nodes that have been identified and coded for. And where you see the color is where that particular passage has been coded for that particular node. So it can be just great if you want to take a look at you know, particular nodes. There are options to go in and look at just selected items. You might want to clear them all and then go in and just look for any one of these particular nodes. Just click on them. It will show you the coding stripes for them. So I want to show you some of the, let's see where we are. For the favorite activity, I also want to point out a little piece of information that is especially useful quantitatively. So here you'll see each of our nodes. Over on the right-hand side, we are looking at that response from all of our participants who responded to that question. You also see some numbers here, the sources and the references. So here you're going to see that these numbers for this particular project are going to match. The source is going to refer to how many transcripts that contain that particular node being coded for. Every child, there are 87 children, every child that was asked this particular question is going to show up in our source data and also in our reference data. This can be useful if you are looking for something like the number of mentions versus the number of kind of people or whatever unit of analysis is. If you're going to see some differences there, it might not always align very clearly. So paying attention to that numerical data can give you a very quick picture of how often your codes are showing up in your data, if you're thinking about each transcript as a unit of analysis, and then also how many times that code is showing up just in all of your data. So if you're coding multiple times for the same code within the same data, you're going to see that actually reflected in your references. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about the collections that you can create in InVito. So Karen mentioned previously that they went through and identified some grouping variables and coded all of the transcripts according to those grouping variables of interest. And you're able to take that information and put it into InVito by identifying different collections. So one of the collections here is all of our adults that participated in an interview. So you can use that grouping variable information to drag each individual transcript into these particular categories. And that becomes useful for when you're doing things like running queries where you're trying to see patterns within patterns. We'll go through a couple of queries in just a moment, but for folks who are interested in using this feature of collections, I did want to show you just kind of what that would look like. So if we were going, let's go back to our internals, do that. So again, we just have our transcript. If we know that this is a child and we want to be able to classify this child in one of our collections, then we can drag the name of that particular transcript over to our person that corresponds with that. So here we would drag it over to children, and then we would be able to very easily pull out all of the folks that are in that category. So now if we want our collections of children, we have them all here. If we want our collections of adults, we have all of our transcripts here. We can use that feature to kind of go through and comb through our data. Another way that this ends up being really useful is for the queries. So we already used adult and child as grouping variables. So now let's say we want to know more about the number of folks who identify as math people. And we can look at differences in responses to this question about whether or not you're a math person based on whether a person is a child or an adult. So here we're able to do a very simple query. This is going to be our adults who identify in different kinds of ways. Yes, I'm a math person. No, I'm not a math person. My child is a math person, or there are a few folks that were unsure of whether they're math people. Our children, we can take a look at similar kinds of information. Here, yes, I'm a math person, or no, I'm not. Where this becomes especially useful is where you're beginning to look at patterns within patterns. And I think that's one of the best ways that you can really see how InVivo offers a lot of value for just what it can do in terms of analysis. So we will take a look at a query for folks who talked about an activity, whether it was fun and frustrating, whether they found it more as frustrating, or if it was more fun, or if they were unsure. And we can also look at that information in terms of how they identify as being whether a math person or not a math person. So here, this is something very similar to kind of what you might encounter in a SPSS as a crosstab. You'll just see within each of these cells where our people are either math people or not math people, and then their ideas about this particular activity they were asked about. So with that, I am going to come back here and ask if there are any questions.
So again, if you have a question that you want to ask out loud, then maybe raise your hand. Or if you have a question for Jen and you'd rather just type it, then feel free to do that as well.
Yeah, thanks for that, Karen. Also, if there are folks on the call that have some experience working with InVito, feel free to kind of share a little snippet about how you've been able to find value in using the software analysis program.
All right, I'm looking. I don't see any hands up or any new questions. Okay. So thank you, Jen. I'm going to attempt to take control again. And then I'm gonna flash through your slides, which I should have done earlier, so apologies. All right. I did want to show the webinar schedule so that we end the call by looking ahead. These you've already seen and heard me talk about if you were part of the September webinar. One thing that we haven't really talked about, but that may be a result of the advisory board meeting, is providing you all with an update about just what happened at that advisory board meeting. We don't yet have a plan for that, but the leadership team is meeting tomorrow. And so one thing I'm interested in, and if you guys could just take a second and maybe type this in the questions. If you would like to have a webinar that gives updates on the advisory board meeting, then please type that in the questions so that we know that you are interested in that you would find that meaningful. You may not feel like you have enough information to weigh in on that one way or the other. And so I'm going to ask I have a second request as well. One of the things that we did with the advisors, we spent one day talking to them about all of the festival data we have and what to do with that and how to think about positioning ourselves, as I said earlier, within the larger public engagement with science landscape. And so day one was all about the festival data, the mini grants, most of where you all spend your time engaging with this project. The second day was more about the research questions that we're supposed to be answering with this project. And those are the questions that we talk to you guys about a few times a year. So we talked a lot. We shared with them the results related to evaluation use. We shared with them the results related to evaluation capacity building. And you guys have shared updates related to those two topics every year in December in the survey, in the research instruments we ask you to complete. But you've also provided a lot of that information in your annual conversations with Taylor and myself, and then with the interviews that Pat did and that Jen sat in on last year in December and January. So one thing that we haven't done with this community yet is present those results back to you. And to sort of talk a little bit from the perspective of, how are people feeling about EvalFest and what it is helping them accomplish, places where it might be doing more. And so one other thing that we're wondering is whether that would be of interest, to take a webinar and focus on those. And so if you wouldn't mind just typing quickly in the questions option or the chat, one or the other, just to let us know, yes, I want to hear more about advisory board updates, and or yes, I want to hear more about the research data. Then we can think about whether we want to add those topics to the webinar schedule a little bit later in the year. For now, our next webinar is going to focus on the partner survey. Taylor has asked you guys to send in partner surveys if you have them. And by partner, what we mean is event hosts. And so if you have host surveys, exhibitor surveys, partner surveys that you use that you would like to contribute to what would really be sort of a coding effort, what we want to do is look across all of those different instruments and then present back to the community what the most common items tend to be. The idea there is that we will take those items and create a survey in SurveyMonkey that we can zap to each of your individual survey accounts if you're interested in using it. And that will be a new resource for you to take advantage of for the last couple of years of the project if you want. Then in January, we're going to hear from Teresa Burris from the St. Pete Festival. She is going to give us a tour of Voyant and Tableau so that we can look at some of the other data viz options that are available. Some of you have said enough with Excel already. Let's look at something fancier. And both of these begin to serve that function. And so we'll be excited to hear what Teresa has to teach us in January. And then in February, we plan to present the year 3 analysis, the annual update of the community level results from the project. So send your partner surveys. If you haven't already done this, please take a second right now to send your partner, exhibitor, event host, whatever you call it, survey to Taylor. Maybe the other thing to say about these, just by way of definition, is that we're not talking about sponsors here. So if you survey your sponsors, if you survey your funders, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about people who help you put on the festival, or other people who partner with you to create programming for your festival calendar. So if you have those, please send them along. And that's it for today. So it looks like we're going to end a few minutes early. If you have, oh, it looks like Roxanne has a question. Taylor, can you help? Oh, and Leanne has a question also. Oh, a lot of people have. Oh, no, that's, sorry. Yeah, that's because I asked you to do that. Thanks to those of you who are compliant and who I just called out for doing what I asked. And there are a bunch of you. Yay, go team. Thanks also for tuning in. We will see you again in a month, and look forward to everybody who has festivals in October and November having a very successful season. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.